Hi, I'm Max Keiser.
I'm Stacy Herbert.
You know, a lot of people ask, what is the root cause behind all these riots? Stacy Herbert, tell us more.
The riots in the street, I might add, and the riots in the markets. Headline reads, quantitative easing is good for the rich, bad for the poor. Quantitative easing, the Bank of England's recession-busting policy of buying up billions of pounds of bonds, may have contributed to social unrest by exacerbating inequality, according to one city economist.
That's because they misdiagnosed the problem back in 2008. They felt that there was a liquidity problem in the markets instead of an insolvency problem at the big banks.
Max, they misdiagnosed it to the public. This is what they told the public, because the evidence suggests that QE cash ends up overwhelmingly in profits, thereby exacerbating already extreme income inequality and the consequent social tensions that arise from it. And he also points out that real wages adjusted for inflation have fallen in both the U.S. and U.K. They've risen in Germany, which has not applied any quantitative easing.
That is correct. And it's incorrect to talk about this in terms of inflation, because inflation implies that wages are going higher, that there's a lot of demand, and that prices are being pulled higher. This is about prices being pushed higher by an infusion of trillions of dollars worth of more debt on top of the existing debt. And it's the interest cost now that's causing these bankers to issue more debt to pay off the interest expense. It's exactly like a household paying off one credit card with another credit card. So Mervyn King at the Bank of England, or over there at the Federal Reserve Bank, Ben Bernanke, they're simply borrowing more to pay off the existing debt. They're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul.
Yes, but it's like the same household members borrowing from each other's credit card, but one gets to borrow at 0%, the other has to borrow at 30%. So essentially they're making just one of the family or the household to pay for it all. Because as he says, quote, real wages and salaries have fallen by £4 billion. Profits are up by £11 billion since the recession.
This is because over the past 10 to 15 years, the banks that were once the intermediary force to match buyers and sellers of loans, they are now subsumed into the structural components of the government itself. So they take the cream off the top and claim it's their prerogative as government functionaries, and they don't actually do standard banking anymore. No one does banking anymore. It's just a matter of siphoning cash.
That's true. And also, again, remember, this quantitative easing is the central bank buying up assets from who? From bankers who get to sell these assets in a deflationary spiral at the previous 100 cents on the dollar price to the central bank. The rest of the population has to live in the deflationary spiral world in which their incomes are deflating.
Right. Basically, the people who are rioting, they've seen their house prices crash because they've been cut out of the Ponzi scheme. Whereas the major banks, as you point out, they're buying and selling assets from each other. These are bonds linked to real estate, but they are not marking to market the value of those loans, quote-unquote assets, and they simply swap them back and forth for huge fees, and they claim this is needed to maintain liquidity and that it's a liquidity issue, instead of the truth is that it's an insolvency issue, and you've got a bunch of captive regulators allowing for this larceny at the top, and therefore it trickles down to the bottom.
Well, in our last episode of Keizer Report, we spoke to William K. Black, and he called this a crimogenic environment in which the regulators and the politicians create an environment in which crime will happen. So let's look at this headline here, following on the first headline, where we know quantitative easing causes wealth and income gaps. Sterling, no refuge, as King eyes stimulus. Bank of England Governor Mervyn King signaled on August 10th that he may resume pumping cash into the economy in order to boost growth.
He has no choice, because the debt monster, both visible and on the shadow banking system, as Gordon Brown himself called it, is this huge out-of-control monster that requires 0% interest rates. There is no risk of rates going higher. That won't happen in anyone's near future. Interest rates will be kept at zero indefinitely, and this is another way to disenfranchise the poor who are rioting as an example of trickle-down larceny.
The other thing I might add is that you could have predicted this in the price of gold, because of course the price signal from gold has told us that this crimogenic atmosphere environment of the UK would not stop, as the price of gold has soared over 1,100 pounds an ounce. That was only 6 or 7 years ago, 200 pounds.
Well, you mentioned something there, price signal. In an environment where prices are manipulated, the bond prices are totally manipulated. The governments are buying their own bonds, so you can't look to them for accurate price discovery. Stock markets are bought 70% bought and sold by computers. There's no price discovery there either. So the only place you have real price discovery is in gold and silver. And gold and silver for 8, 9, 10 years has been saying that it's not a commodity, it's a currency, and it's going to go higher as the crimogenic wave increases and gets bigger and bigger.
Speaking of price signals, the most important price signal in our economy is, of course, oil. Saudi need for oil at $85 may speed cutback. So this is a cutback in Saudi oil production being predicted. If the price of oil, which is now at about 85, if it goes below that, that's Saudi break-even point due to the financial disaster happening in the West, of course. The Saudi royal family has had to spend over $100 billion placating their population to keep it from looking like London.
So the same machinations in the markets we see at work keeping interest rates at zero, that is the kowtowing to the banking terrorists, and their need to foster larceny at the top end of society, is at work in the Middle East in that we now have a floor on oil at $85 a barrel because this is the price needed to placate their rioting population. For them, they are just buying off their rioting population with cash as a result of selling oil. Of course, the UK is running out of oil due to peak oil, so it's implementing other solutions which are going to be dead on arrival.
You can also see how we are at the peak system that we have at the moment, because we have a petrodollar, basically, a dollar backed by oil. But they're in a death grip. Saudi Arabia can't do with less than $85 because of the disaster of the US-based debt system, which has clearly not been fixed. So, but because of that, the US can't ever grow out of those debts, the Western world, because oil cannot go below $85.
Right, and you also will never have the demand for credit to keep that credit Ponzi scheme going like it has been because of the failure to find new significant oil discoveries that would require a massive draw on credit. So this is peak credit working along with peak oil and peak everything else, peak globalization, peak financialization. So things are falling apart, and they're falling apart in different countries in different ways.
Now, speaking of resources, I want to go to this headline for an interesting quote in this story. Is Jeremy Grantham the world's most powerful environmentalist? So Jeremy Grantham is the head of asset management for GMO, and he's talking about global warming, and he says global warming is bad news, finite resources is investment advice, therefore that you should pitch the global warming story as an investment story. But the interesting thing is, I think he's really wrong here when he says this. Americans are just about the worst at dealing with long-term problems, down there with Uzbekistan. But they respond to a market signal better than almost anyone. They roll the dice bigger and quicker than most.
I think he's referring to things like the threat during the 60s of Sputnik, which got a response right away to put a man on the moon. And America won the space race. And so he's saying that if you could position this as in such a frame as this, that it were to acquire this type of gung-ho attitude, and it's an investment device or there's an urgency behind it, that people would get behind it. But you see, the problem here, as I see it, is that that would require leadership.
I think it's kind of the opposite, Max. I see it as a population who is dumbed down through everything being taken care of them. So they see the price signal. The price signal on oil has been there for the last 5 years. We've seen it at $100, consistently over $100. They've done nothing. Fuel efficiency standards have not increased. They are not responding to prices. They are just sitting there dumb thinking that, well, our government will go invade Libya and we'll be taken care of. Our government invaded Iraq. Won't they take care of us always on this issue?
Yeah, well, the price of gas, which is independent really of the price of oil per se, is the price signal that tells Americans that everything is okay.
Now, the other reason why people might be failing to respond to a price signal is that we live in a crimogenic environment where crime goes unpunished. It happens without any sort of regulation. So we don't know what prices are real. Lord Miners calls for inquiry on black box trading. Lord Miners, the former city minister, has called on the government to launch a focused inquiry into so-called black box computerized trading in the wake of extreme volatility in the UK's biggest companies. So he alleges that the £300 billion knocked off the FTSE in London is due to high-frequency trading.
It is. So is the downgrade of U.S. Treasury to create the volatility to make it easier for high-frequency trading and black box trading to extract more wealth from the exchanges. That's why they put the servers next to the exchanges themselves to siphon the cash off more quickly and more efficiently. And this is, without a doubt, an instance of looting by Wall Street banks, by the banks in the city. They're looting $100 million a day by one estimate, and they get no punishment whatsoever. Then you go to London riots, and somebody is caught stealing a pack of gum, and they get 6 months in the clinker. Again, I asked David Cameron about this. I mean, he's not a stupid man, but when he fails to see the problem here, one has to ask oneself, is he in fact a moron?
Well, look at this. 50% of trading in London is high-frequency trading. And people are saying that it's putting ordinary investors at a disadvantage due to the speed which with such trades are placed. So they're stealing from ordinary investors. David Cameron in Parliament last week stated that he would investigate whether social networking sites should be shut down if they helped to plot crime. So what are these high-frequency trading algorithms but plotting crime? It's plotting crime. They know when they write these algorithms that they are going to steal with it.
They're plotting crime. They've mechanized crime. It's an assembly line of crime. They're extracting wealth, and as a result, trickle-down larceny kicks in, and you have kids stealing gum at the corner shop and rioting, caused by larceny at the top. The people who can't see that are obviously in bed with the larcenists, and they should stop looking at the arsonists and start looking at themselves as the larcenists. Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keizer Report.
Thank you, Max.
Stay tuned, don't go away. Much more coming your way.
Hungry for the full story? We've got it firsthand. The biggest issues get a human voice, face to face with the newsmakers on RT.
Welcome to the future, bringing you the latest in science and technology from around Russia.
We've got the future covered. Download the official RT application to your iPhone or iPod Touch from the iTunes App Store. Watch RT live on the go. Video on demand. RT's live broadcasts. And RSS feeds now in the palm of your hand. Question more on RT.com.
Welcome back to the Keizer Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to San Francisco and talk with Richard Heinberg, author of many books, including his latest, The End of Growth. Richard, welcome to the Keizer Report.
Good to be with you, Max.
All right, Richard Heinberg, markets around the world are once again volatile. Once again, credit is evaporating. Tell us how energy plays into the chaotic peak debt scenario.
Well, Economic activity ultimately depends on energy and raw materials. We tend to forget that. We think money makes the world go round, but really, when you get right down to it, it's energy and raw materials. So we've benefited from extraordinarily cheap, concentrated energy sources for many decades, really since the start of the Industrial Revolution, but we've been extracting them using the low-hanging fruit principle. So even though there's still lots of oil, coal, and natural gas left in the ground, we're going toward lower and lower grade resources all the time. That means more and more investment capital is needed in exploration and production. And that means the cost is increasing, and that's one of the main reasons that oil is $100 a barrel today instead of $20, which is what was being forecast a decade ago. So that has real impacts all through the economy. It increases the cost of shipping, which hurts globalization. It increases the cost of running automobiles, which hurts consumers, so they have less in their pocketbooks to spend. And in an economy like the U.S. that depends on 70% of consumer activity for its economic growth, that's a real problem. In effect, I think high oil prices are a cap on world economic activity right now.
All right, so although people talk about the economy slowing down around the world, price of oil is still strong, trending higher due to its scarcity now kicking in this peak oil scenario. But getting back to the question of debt and peak credit, over the past 50 years, the growth of the banking industry, the growth of financialization, the growth of the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme like Wall Street, layer upon layer upon layer of derivatives and debt and more derivatives, has been contingent on the growth of credit as it relates to oil. And so talk about the interactivity between peak debt and peak oil.
Debt has become the lifeblood of the society in many ways. We have a debt-based currency. The way we create money these days is through bank loans. So in order to grow the economy, in order to grow the money supply, we have to have ever more debt. So we've done that over the past several decades, particularly the last couple of decades. Consumer debt has grown. Of course, we suffered in the early part of the 20th century from overproduction. With cheap oil, we could make stuff faster than people could buy it, so we created the advertising industry and the consumer credit industry. And after the early 1970s, when U.S. wages started to stagnate, people continued to buy more stuff because they were being talked into it by the advertising industry. But the only way they could do it was by taking on more consumer debt. So with credit cards, and of course they were encouraged to do this by the banking industry. So with credit cards and cheap home loans, people got loaned up to their eyeballs. And this is one of the problems with the U.S. economy right now, why a recovery is almost impossible, because the levels of consumer debt are just, intolerable. There's no way the average American can take on more debt, and there's no way that the banks will loan them more money because they're not creditworthy at this point with very high unemployment and stagnant wages. So we're at this fundamental turning point where we've reached the limits both to our energy supplies and to debt, both consumer debt and now government debt, as we're seeing not only in Washington but also in Europe.
Okay, a report out of the UK this week says that quantitative easing is making the rich richer and the poor poorer by driving up prices of assets, including commodities like oil. What do you think the role of the Fed is in terms of the price of oil?
Well, by creating liquidity for the banks, that does encourage speculation in oil. But I don't think there's that much of an effect. What we're really looking at is higher oil prices being driven, first of all, by higher costs within the industry, and second, by higher demand in China and other Asian countries. what the Fed is doing with quantitative easing is kind of a desperate measure. There's some understanding there that the government is kind of the last resort for keeping the economy growing. And government spending and borrowing have really paid for the recent U.S. recovery. But now, politically in the U.S., more government borrowing is really impossible. It's a political orphan. Neither Democrats nor Republicans want to claim it. So the Fed is left with its very small toolbox of solutions, and quantitative easing is basically what's left on the table. It doesn't work. In fact, none of the policy solutions that are on the table in Washington will really work to get the country back into economic growth. But the Fed is going to try the one thing it knows, and I would expect to see more quantitative easing in the future, even though it's not going to work.
Yeah, let's stick on the Fed for a second. We've seen now Ed Miliband, who leads the opposition Labour Party in the UK, make a direct attack on David Cameron, saying, look, if you want to get to the root causes of these riots in London, you need to, let's talk about the looting that's going on, being enabled by the Bank of England and the central banking system. Also in the U.S., you've got Ron Paul, who's now the front runner, the only serious front runner in the Republican camp running for president. Suddenly his campaign has taken on its emergency. He's been running on this audit the Fed, and the Fed is the problem issue. Have we turned a corner, Richard Heinberg? Do you think, that finally people are putting the pieces together and see the role of the Fed, fiat money, fractional reserve banking, and this failure to address economics and try to replace it with what Bush Sr. used to call voodoo economics? Do you think people finally get it?
Well, I think people on the far left and the far right are getting it, and that leaves the great majority of people in the middle, who are being led, primarily by the mainstream media, who still don't really see what's going on. They feel very uneasy. They have this sense that, neither more stimulus will work, nor will austerity, and they're absolutely right. But that leaves them with nothing.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, you are saying that the role of speculators who are emboldened by a lot of this cheap money and cheap credit that's put out there by the Fed, that's really not the key factor when we're talking about $85 oil, $100 oil. It's the supply and demand having to do with rising demand in the East versus shrinking supply in the ground. And you also said something interesting there, in that you believe that the Saudi oil field, Ghawar, is in decline, along with Bergen and Cantarell. Is that a fair statement to make?
Yeah, I mean, the Saudis have been managing their oil fields with all the latest technology, and doing it, I think, probably as responsibly as they could. But the reality is, Ghawar is an old oil field. It was discovered back in the late 1940s. We can't expect even the world's largest oil field to keep producing at maximum rate forever. And there's every sign that that oil field has reached the end of its glory days. So the Saudis are bringing on other oil fields. They've been drilling like crazy the last few years, and they claim to have up to 4 million barrels a day of spare production capacity. That doesn't seem realistic. What they're talking about is the possibility of absolute emergency measures. They could perhaps bring on another 2.5, 3, maybe even 4 million barrels a day over a short term, but that would damage their oil fields. If you produce an oil field absolutely flat out maximum rate, it tends to reduce the ultimately recoverable amount from that field. So the Saudis don't want to do that. They want to continue managing their fields responsibly, which means that they're probably never going to produce any more than they are right now.
Richard Heinberg, so I was speaking with Stacy Herbert in the first half of the show, and we were discussing price signals as it relates to oil. And the question is, with oil generating a price signal of $100 a barrel, you would think in a capitalist society that relies on price signals to communicate to the market what should be done, that this would be a glaring price signal that either A, alternative energy needs to be explored more thoroughly, or there needs to be some preparation for what is obviously a supply problem in coming not through the pipeline. Why has there been such a failure for normally rational capitalists in America to respect the price signal that oil is telling us?
Yeah, well, in Capitalism 101, there's the notion of substitution, that, when any commodity gets more expensive, that the market starts looking for substitutes. Well, that's fine in theory, but what's the substitute? What do we use instead of oil? Biofuels, they've been around for years, and there's been enormous government subsidy for ethanol production here in the U.S., something like 40% of the total corn harvest goes to making ethanol, and that 40% of all the corn grown in the U.S. going to make ethanol still only replaces 3 or 4% of the gasoline that we're using. So there's no substitute out on the horizon immediately. Now, of course, everyone's talking about electric cars, and the government's offering some subsidies for electric cars. But how long will it take before electric cars make up even 10% of the total U.S. fleet? Well, nobody knows the exact answer to that question, but it's going to be at current rates well over 20 years. So, yes, the price signal is there, but there's no obvious response.
That's going to have to do it for this edition of the Keizer Report. Thanks so much, Richard Heinberg, for being our guest.
It's been a pleasure, Max. Thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keizer Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Richard Heinberg. If you want to send me an email, please do so at KeiserReport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.